Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Muhai's online public interview series. For those who have joined us for the first time, thanks so much for tuning in. I think we can all agree that the world in which we live in has changed dramatically over the past few months. In such circumstances, we see new questions and new challenges being raised every single day. To respond to such times, we turn to the experts. This interview series will bring in a number of different academics from various disciplines and have a conversation about their unique perspective on the world. Today, we're joined by Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. Thanks so much for giving us your time today. So just to start off with, could you introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a little bit more about what you do?
So I'm a senior lecturer in clinical psychology at the University of Melbourne, and so I teach clinical psychology students. I do research on mindfulness and meditation and mood and anxiety disorders, and also I do some modeling of how anxiety symptoms and depressive symptoms fluctuate over time.
Awesome. Okay. Let's talk about the state of things. As I mentioned in the intro, the world has changed pretty dramatically over the past few months. What are some of the changes in circumstances that create a sense of heightened anxiety?
Well, certainly I think that the biggest part of it is uncertainty. So people are not entirely sure what to expect. They're not clear what's going to happen going forward. There's been considerable ambiguity in the information, particularly in the early days of the current pandemic, sort of as announcements were being made, both at the government level, at the international level, even at the university level. There was a lot of ambiguity as to exactly how different policies, different structures, different things are going to work. For example, at the University of Melbourne, the sort of advice that we were getting sort of was changing on a near daily basis in terms of how courses were going to proceed. And so that level of inconsistency and uncertainty can create a lot of anxiety for individuals, sort of not knowing what's going to happen. So a lot of people had pretty clear plans on how they wanted this semester to progress and what they wanted to do and how they wanted to manage their workload. And all of that's kind of been upended, and it's been replaced with this incredible uncertainty as to, what's going to happen next. We've all been stuck at home, working from home. We've now all become experts on Zoom. And, the question sort of as to, well, when can we start going back out? When can we start to do things, as we used to do them? And when will that happen? How will that happen? What will that look like? I think there's just so much more unknown in this process. So that's something that in healthy individuals, it creates a lot of anxiety. And for those who are already experiencing certain levels of mental health problems, it just exacerbates things that are already there. So I would say uncertainty is probably the biggest factor, I think, contributing to a lot of this.
Absolutely. So there is one thing we're certain about, is that we're going to be in isolation for a while. So from a mental health and well-being perspective, what are some of the challenges that we face when being in extended periods of isolation?
I mean, there's a number of sort of issues that go along with being in isolation. I guess it depends on the nature of your isolation. Obviously, some people have larger spaces to roam about. Obviously, some people have company, welcome or unwelcome. Some people have, pets and loved ones and things like that around, and other people don't. Regardless of the circumstances, I think it's challenging for everyone. One of the issues sort of is, you're quarantined or you're confined to fairly constant spaces. So there's not a whole lot of new stimuli or changing environments as there normally would be. So, when we get sick of being in a certain setting, we sort of get sick of being in our office or in our room or wherever, we often would go out and seek out a different environment. And so kind of being stuck in one setting on a regular basis is something that a lot of people find quite frustrating. Along with that, sort of, obviously our social contact is limited to, for the most part, what we can do via, interfaces such as what we're using currently. So, it's not quite the same. We don't have quite the same social interactions as we used to. And one thing that I'm sure many people will have noticed is, as you go out, as you go exercising, as you go shopping, your social interactions with other people is dramatically altered. There's sort of an interaction component of potentially fear, of worrying about the other person, as opposed to sort of just passing people and smiling and saying hello and how are you doing or things of that. There's sort of gone are sort of the casual chats perhaps with your neighbors or someone that you might bump into in the grocery store. And now it's sort of just viewed as well, I need to get out, I need to exercise, I need to get home, I need to get to the shops, pick up all my groceries, get home and wash all of my groceries in my hands as quickly as possible while talking to as few people as possible. So, I mean, these sort of things are quite different than what we used to. Now, in the sort of the period of isolation itself, it can progress. And as you said, it's an unknown how long we're going to be doing this for. And so we need to be really aware of the ways in which this is affecting us individually and societally. And I think it's important to recognize that it really can create sadness, it can create frustration, it can create aggravation, it can create tension, it can create anxiety. And we really need to be aware of all of these feelings as they're arising and have some means of actually responding to them and having some adaptive mechanism to work with those feelings. So one of the best things we can do sort of is to create routines. We can create routines in our day. We can sort of come up with plans of how to demarcate, when does work start and when does work end? And that sort of sounds really obvious, but all of us have been living that now, and many of us will now recognize that it's not as easy as it sounds. You're working from the same place that you're living, and so the carryover, the blurring of boundaries is complicated. It's hard. It's hard to know, what is my workspace and what is my home space, and how do I interact with people for the purposes of work versus for the purposes of fun. So helping to sort of create clear, clean boundaries between those things, even when it sort of becomes, I dress one way when I'm sort of turning up for work, or I do my work, even if it's in a one-room, apartment or something, I segregate one corner of the apartment for kind of work, and I sort of have a separate corner of the apartment for other things. And I physically will move my computer if I need to. So things like that can be quite helpful. Scheduling positive events, sort of planning to do things that are fun is quite important. Ensuring that you're still getting to do things that you enjoy to the extent that you can. Coming up with plans for healthy eating, for exercise. Still doing all the things that you enjoy. You just have to be a bit more creative about how you do those things. And then of course, the thing that we're planning to talk quite a bit about today, there are actually mental activities that you can do to help you manage emotions as they come up. And there are things that you can sort of do to respond to the sort of fluctuations in your experiences and to not become overwhelmed by them. And that's where something like mindfulness really comes into play.
Absolutely. Let's talk about mindfulness then. We'll start on the more practical side of things. So I'm not sure if I can ask this, but what is mindfulness? Is it easy to ask that? Is there some kind of definition?
It's easily asked, and it's probably the question that I get asked most regularly, and the one that I sort of often demur the most on, because it is incredibly difficult to define. There are commonly used definitions, and many people talk about it as a particular sort of way of paying attention, or a particular sort of feature of awareness where you're in the present moment, and you're sort of trying to act in a way that is non-judgmental. It's intentional. You're going out of your way to sort of place yourself here and now, without sort of that, suspending kind of judgment about what you're experiencing. But there's a lot more to it than that. And that's sort of just a definition of convenience that people kind of turn to out of a way to sort of say, well, this is sort of one way of thinking about this much more complicated concept. And the reality sort of is, mindfulness comes from, in many cases or many instances, from a broad, complex tradition of practices. And so some of the other features of those traditions often carry over. That doesn't mean they have to, or that you have to use them, but it's often useful to know what those features or sort of those ideas are.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I've encountered when I've done a little bit of research online about mindfulness is that I hear the term meditation and mindfulness being used interchangeably. Is there a difference between these two things?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty common for people to sort of confuse or to interchange these two terms and sort of talk about meditation and mindfulness as if they're one and the same. In reality, they're quite different. So, when we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about a particular idea or concept, or a particular type of meditation practice. Whereas meditation actually refers to any type of broad contemplative practice or concentrated practice. And mindfulness can actually be one subset or one type of meditation practice. So there's lots of different types of meditation. There's practices where you focus on a mantra, or where you focus on the breath, or where you walk around and you focus on the sensations on your feet, or where you focus on connection with God or spirit, or where you do something like Tai Chi. So all of these different things can be meditation. Mindfulness, in the context of meditation, it's typically considered to be a subset or a subtype of meditation practice. Now, we also often draw a distinction between what we consider to be formal meditation practice or formal mindfulness. And that's sort of where you intentionally sit down, maybe on a chair or cushion, or you lie down, or you sort of go to a particular space or place. And your goal is actually to engage with some kind of concentrated practice for a prolonged period of time. And then there's what we call informal mindfulness. And that, when we talk about sort of the attitude or the idea of mindfulness, that's sort of something that we say that people should do kind of in their day-to-day life. So you can invoke the attitude of mindfulness, or you can invoke mindfulness, as you're walking down the street, or as you're washing the dishes, or as you're doing your laundry. So you can be mindful in sort of everyday context, but you can also commit to doing a regular sort of concentrated or effortful mindfulness practice as well. So those are also important distinctions.
So to summarize, meditation is more of an umbrella term that brings together different kinds of concentration practices.
Yeah, that's a useful way of thinking about it. It's a much broader term. Of course, when you talk to some people, many people would say mindfulness is an umbrella term as well. And people sort of use mindfulness as sort of a stand-in for lots of different things.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, mindfulness is a more narrow aspect or feature, whereas meditation sort of represents all kinds of different concentrative or as we call them, contemplative practices.
Yep. Okay. So let's get into how I can start the practice of mindfulness. Let's say I'm a complete beginner. I've never done it before. How do I even start?
So there's lots of different resources that are available for helping individuals to start practicing mindfulness or meditation. I think the first thing to do is to do some research and to figure out what it is that you actually hope to achieve. So are you looking to become a little bit more balanced? Are you looking to better understand yourself? Are you looking to become enlightened? Or are you looking to manage mental health symptoms? And I think all of those things are really important. It's one of the things that I really emphasize to people is to know what it is that you want to achieve by engaging in the practice, because what it is, the goal will determine what practice you might decide to engage with. So if you're just looking for something to make you a little bit more calm and a little bit more relaxed, what you might engage with will be quite different to if you're looking for something like enlightenment. That said, once you've done a bit of research and you kind of know what you are looking for and you know what you hope to achieve, there's a number of resources that sort of can help individuals learn how to practice. And in present times, many of the major meditation centers internationally have made guided meditations, guided seminars, guided sessions freely available. So one of the most common types of practice or forms of practice that has a lot of scientific evidence behind it is something called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts, they've essentially recently provided a number of guided courses and instructions and made them available freely online. The Oxford Mindfulness Center has done a similar thing. Then, of course, there's a number of other more non-secular organizations that have also made guided meditation practices available. So there's a Buddhist magazine called Tricycle, and they've made a number of guided meditation practices available for free online there. Then, of course, there's things like apps. And so there's any number of apps and resources that might also help you to learn to practice. I think what's critical to know is that each of these different practices come from different traditions, they have different purposes, and they have different goals. So when you sort of, when you hear about a particular program or app, it's important to ask lots of questions and think about sort of, well, what is this app for? Who stands to benefit from promoting the practice? What's the tradition from which it comes? What's the expertise level of the person that's providing the training? In certain cases, the goal of the program, the goal of the company, the expertise level, they all may be, along the lines of, well, the goal is to make money. The expertise level is whatever's needed to sell you the product. And, the kind of information that they're providing you with nice pictures, pleasant sounding voices, and wonderful music in the background. And what I would often say is that, if that's the case, it's probably not the best way to get started, unless, if you want a pleasant experience, I would suggest, have an app or watch a movie or go for a jog, whatever it is that you find pleasant. The reality often is that, what I consider to be true meditation or real mindfulness is often not a particularly easy thing to do. And so it's really important to identify a resource that provides guided instruction in a really helpful and useful way. And often that's in some kind of interactive way. So there's a discussion board, there's direct sort of consultation with experienced teachers, and there's people who know something also about mental health so that they can guide you when you're actually really struggling, and they can differentiate between what's sort of just typical run-of-the-mill meditation-related difficulties versus when are you actually potentially making a mental health situation worse. So that said, the kinds of things that I like, I've already mentioned a couple of resources, but if you're really looking for an app, there are a few that I think are particularly good and sort of have gotten a number of reviews that sort of are quite positive from a number of people in the research community. 10% Happier is one that a lot of people really seem to like. There's an app by Sam Harris called Waking Up. I myself use and refer a lot of people to a program called Insight Timer. The former two that I've referenced are ones that are really nice in the sense they have really strong, structured, and really well-developed guided programs. Insight Timer is nice in the sense that it has a lot of flexibility and it has a lot of content. One thing you have to be aware of if you're going to try using Insight Timer is that it's kind of like an Amazon platform. They just they create opportunities for people to provide you with guided meditation content. And so you need to be careful about what it is you pick from that sort of app, in the sense that, not all meditation is created equal. Much as, if you were seeking out psychotherapy, you wouldn't just randomly pick the first person that turns up on a web page if you type in psychotherapy. You'd need to spend some time thinking about, okay, well, who actually does something that is consistent with what we know, in the tradition, or at least from scientific evidence, that actually is helpful.
Okay. So based on our personal needs, you recommend that we go out and research the resource that tailors to our needs the most?
Yeah, and I mean, you can do all kinds of things, right? You can spend 5 minutes a day just doing mindful washing the dishes, which is often not a bad place to start. Or you can engage fully in an 8-week course. So depending on the extent to which you want to get involved, there are lots of different options available. The one thing I would say is there are a number of people who sort of think that the best way to start is to fully immerse yourself. And even in normal times, I highly recommend against that. I would definitely recommend against such a thing in this context, because these fully immersive sort of retreats, or if you were to try to engage them yourself, are often incredibly difficult and they're sort of incredibly complicated, and all kinds of things will come up that you're not used to experiencing. So I mean, we're kind of engaged in one of the greatest meditation experiments that we've ever been in the sense that many of us are isolated by our own, and so we already know some of sort of the negative things, all the thoughts that can come to the front of our mind when we're left alone with our thoughts. And that's exactly the reason that you don't want to engage in the type of practice if you've got no formal training, if you've never done this before, where you go off on a silent retreat for 10 days and all you do is sort of contemplate your thoughts and sort of eat vegetarian food, and you're in a sort of setting that you've never been in before. For the same reason, now is not the time to sort of spend 8 hours a day just meditating with very little structure, or I shouldn't say structure, but with very little oversight or interaction with other people, because a lot could happen that's unexpected, and it could be incredibly hard to actually get support should something go wrong.
Yeah. Well, if anything, a 10-day retreat with just plain vegetarian food actually sounds a little bit more stressful than just staying at home.
Well, it depends on whether or not. I mean, often they're quite wonderful vegetarian meals and food. But yes, at the moment, I think it would be quite difficult to sort of if you were to sort of try to commit to that kind of intensive practice on your own. It'd be really hard for you to actually structure that and do that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I just jump straight in without any experience, it's almost as if I'd be sitting there doing nothing, just ruminating in my own thoughts, which really doesn't sound that productive.
That's exactly the problem, is that sort of it's hard to know, if you're just starting out, what kinds of things you're meant to be experiencing, or what this is meant to look like. And it can be too easy to sort of get caught up and sort of go down the wrong path, so to speak, and just ruminate or worry kind of over and over and over again, which just tends to exacerbate the reasons why you picked up the practice in the first place. That said, these kinds of things can be incredibly powerful and useful. It's just my general recommendation to people is, before you sign up for one of these intensive retreats, try a little bit of it first to see which tradition, which program, which type of teacher you like, and whether or not it's beneficial and it sort of helps you to kind of get the kinds of the attainments or goals that you're interested in.
Definitely. So let's say we give this a shot. We're in isolation, we want to relax and calm down a little bit. It's quite an anxious time. So I've started mindfulness. How do I know that I'm doing it right? Am I supposed to feel anything internally? What do you think?
It's a really great question, and it's actually quite complicated in the sense that most people think that meditation and mindfulness is about relaxation, and it's actually not. So the reality is that many people use it as a relaxation type practice, and it can definitely have that effect. But that's often not the goal of most traditional mindfulness or meditation practices. The goal is not necessarily relaxation. The goal is often to better understand yourself and better understand your own mind. Many people often consider the relaxation component or the component whereby they maybe feel better or they feel blissful to be a byproduct in the sense that, that's not really the goal. So one of the things I often tell people is that if it feels really wonderful all the time, you're potentially not doing it right. So oftentimes the reality is that it's quite difficult, sitting down with your own thoughts, focusing on your breath. One of the things that you often notice, even if you're just doing it for a few minutes, if you're not used to doing this kind of thing, is that your mind wanders off. You start thinking about something else. You start thinking maybe in this context of when the hell am I going to be able to, go to a footy game again? When am I going to be able to, go to see a movie again in the theater? And so you'll notice that your mind starts wandering off to those things. And part of the process is just going, that's okay. Okay, I just noticed my mind wandered off. I'm going to bring it back to the breath. And you just keep doing that gently over and over and over again. And what I find and what I often find in talking to people who practice is that when you have those kinds of experiences when you're meditating that are difficult, where you really struggle to keep your mind focused on what it is that you want to, that's actually when you learn the most. So when you have these experiences where the period of practice just feels amazing, you feel incredibly concentrated, calm, potentially relaxed. There's probably not a whole lot of growth going on there. Now that said, one of the things that's really interesting, I think, for a lot of people when they first start to practice is as you do this practice, as I said, it's about getting to know yourself better. And one particular practice that a lot of people start with is a practice called the body scan, where you direct your attention to different parts of your body. You may start with your toes, and you move your way slowly up your leg. You continue to breathe the entire time, and the goal is just to have greater awareness of what's going on in different parts of your body without trying to change what it feels like in that part of your body. And what happens for a lot of people is they notice tension, or they notice achiness, or they notice incredible fatigue. And I can honestly tell you, the first time I started practicing meditation, when I was doing these body scans, I used to fall asleep and have the most amazing naps that I've ever had in my life. And this is certainly not the goal of the practice, but the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, one of the things that he talks about, his name's Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he sort of says, if you're doing this practice and you recognize that you're just exhausted, what he says is just stop, go have a nap. You don't need to practice mindfulness and meditation if you're tired. What you need to do is have a nap. And so part of this practice is actually learning to be more aware of the needs of your body and mind. And in that process, you're better able to actually meet the needs of your body and mind. And so as you go, okay, I'm hungry, or I need a nap, or actually I'm not hungry, or actually, you know what, I'm incredibly wound up and agitated. Maybe what I really need is some physical activity. I need some exercise. So it's important to learn to recognize those things. So I guess how you know if you're doing it right, it's hard to say, but one of the things I can almost guarantee you is if you're doing it right, it will be difficult. Your mind will wander off, things will distract you. If it feels incredibly pleasant, it feels blissful, it feels wonderful, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, but I can almost guarantee you that whatever those feelings are, they won't last. There will be periods when it's difficult. And one of the things we tell many people who are beginning this is that set an amount of time that you want to practice for. Maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's 15 minutes. Practice no less than that and practice no more than that. Now, there's a key reason for that. If things are going horribly, right, you set aside, you're gonna meditate for 10 minutes, and it just feels unbearable. Like I cannot get myself to concentrate or focus. Getting yourself committing to that 10 minutes, it helps you to recognize that, oh, actually, I thought it was unbearable. I thought I couldn't do it, but I actually could. I could just push myself that little bit extra, and I can help myself to recognize that, actually, what I thought was impossible wasn't by any means, and I can find ways to get through even initially what feel like pretty unbearable or unpleasant experiences. On the flip side of that, prolonging things and sort of grasping after something that feels pleasant is not particularly productive either, because you may have an experience of feeling really calm or relaxed, and trying to always go after that experience, trying to always feel wonderful, is almost akin to seeking the effects that we get from abusing substances. You're searching for that thing that sort of makes you feel better, and the problem is that you're potentially not going to get that the next time you sit down to meditate.
So the goal of mindfulness is actually not to chase the feel good, but to get to know yourself a little bit better. And when you say that, you mean to get to know all the different physical sensations happening within your body. Are you
Absolutely. So
hungry or
another term that's often used for mindfulness is vipassana, which actually roughly translates to insight. And so it's getting to know all of you, right? So it's your
Yep.
body, your mind, how you feel in the moment, how these things all work together. So you're gaining insight into what it feels like to be you in your body, in your mind, in the moment. And you're then learning how to work with that, how to manage that, how to be that. And so one of the things that's often talked about as well is that the difference between what we think of as being mode, that is just being where you are, and doing mode, which is sort of making plans and doing things. So it's really quite interesting in that, being mode, sort of just not trying to actually achieve anything, but just having the goal of just being wherever you are, whatever, being with whatever you're experiencing, and just having no plans, just doing that, is so fundamentally different from how we normally go about our day-to-day lives. We normally try to be achieving things. We strive for excellence, or we strive for creativity, or things of that nature. And there's really one of the principles we talk about in mindfulness is non-striving. Your goal is to kind of not have a goal, to just be where you are, which is really different than what we normally do.
Yeah, especially nowadays. It's always about go, go, go. There's no time to stop and reflect and actually be in the moment, right?
And that's one of the reasons, I think, for many people that the current situation is so difficult, right? Because we spent so much time in our day-to-day lives striving, right? We're constantly going, we're constantly looking at our phones, we're constantly rushing out the door to get to the next thing. We're constantly thinking about, okay, after I finish this class, I'll get to the next one. After I finish this degree, I'll get to that one. After I finish this initial job, I'll get to the next job, where, and that sort of, we're always kind of long-term goal oriented, and we're always rushing from one thing to the next. And all of a sudden, we're now forced to be in a situation where we can't do that. So it's very unsettling for many people to sort of find themselves face to face with a situation where you're not rushing from thing to thing to thing. And it's tempting for many of us to fill the space, to sort of fill our days back to back to back with meetings, with Zoom things, with activities. And the reality is, if we do that, we're probably going to burn out a lot faster than we would have had we been on campus, or had we been in our day-to-day jobs. Because real life, even though we're rushing from place to place to place, there's inherently buffers. There's the time that it takes for you to walk from place A to place B, and during that time, you're probably doing something kind of like mindfulness. There's a period of time where maybe you're just thinking about walking, or maybe you're just thinking about, I need to go and get a cup of coffee, or I need some lunch. And so the reality is that in our normal day-to-day lives, there's a lot of buffer space. There's a lot of time for us to just kind of veg out and listen to some music while we're on the tram or whatever. And now that we're stuck in quarantine, it's really tempting to not create that space, to not create time to just adjust and just relax and just kind of be where we are. And so this is where principles of mindfulness can be incredibly helpful at this point in time, because we need to create that space to just be, to just kind of veg out, to just relax, to just let our mind wander. Otherwise, all of our efforts to kind of be creative, to be excellent, will really backfire.
Yep, awesome. So let's say we do want to create this space within ourselves. What are some of the factors that influence the efficacy of the mindfulness practice?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think, in terms of thinking about how well a practice works, that there's a lot of sort of things to consider. And I think it depends on whether you mean works clinically or works for the purposes of sort of someone achieving a particular goal. In terms of sort of, the evidence and what there is out there. So I guess I'm not sure, are you thinking about practical tips and hints about things that help the practice? Yeah.
The more practical things. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, in day-to-day basis, I think one of the things that sort of is quite useful is, as I said, sort of, just as you would with any other behavior change, is kind of come up with a plan and stick to it. So when we're going back, I sort of initially talked about the difference between what we call formal practice, that is sort of sitting down on a cushion or a chair, or lying down on the floor and doing kind of a formal practice, maybe a guided practice. And then there's what we call informal practice. And it's quite important to actually schedule time to do that formal practice. And so maybe that's every morning when you get up, maybe it's every evening. And it should be something that hopefully you do you kind of in the same place or in the same space. And maybe you want to create a safe space, or maybe you want to create a space in your home or in your apartment, or maybe it's in your garage or in your backyard, where you know that you're not going to be interrupted, where you know that you can sort of give your undivided attention to that. And hopefully to some extent where you know that the usual kind of cues or stressors or things that will come into your day-to-day life will not pop in and interrupt you. So if you're using an app on your phone to help you, one of the best things you can do is put your phone on airplane mode, right? It's really important that, when you're trying to do this and when you're trying to learn, that you not have more obstacles in the way. So putting your phone on airplane mode will mean that, you don't make it harder for yourself to do the practice. That's, you're not getting email alerts or text messages or phone calls in the middle of that practice session, because honestly, it's already hard enough as it is. You don't need anything else getting in the way. So that's one thing, is sort of just configuring, giving yourself the best chance possible for it to quote unquote work. Now the reality is if you only do the practice when you really feel like you need it, it won't work. We often talk about the fact that, we think of sort of doing these practices or doing kind of relaxation techniques when we need them the most. So when you're the most stressed out. But if you try doing it when you most need it, it's kind of like fixing a car while you're driving it. You can't really repair the car while the car is moving. You have to stop. You have to understand the car. You have to understand how it's put together. In order to sort of be able to actually have any chance of sort of repairing it while it's in motion. So that's sort of the relationship between the formal and the informal practice, is that if you don't do the formal practice, it's going to make using the practice or doing informal practice, that is applying it when you're really stressed out or when you really feel like you need it, that much harder. So one of the, as I said, really critical to sort of developing kind of the habit is creating all the conditions necessary for a habit, a good habit, and sticking to that. So making a plan for, okay, I'm going to do this every day for 5 minutes, and I'm going to do it in the morning at this time. I'm going to set reminders. I'm going to use a timer. So Insight Timer has a wonderful tracking app that allows you sort of to commit to, okay, I'm going to do this every day for weeks. Set goals. Maybe announce to your friends or accept some kind of challenge on Facebook. Or actually, a wonderful thing coming up at the start of May is Mindful in May. So there's a commitment to sort of this practice for a month, and there's an example of where every I think it's every day, or maybe it's every hour or whatever that you meditate, a certain amount of money will get donated to a good cause. And so there's great sort of things like that can help you to actually encourage you to practice. Now that said, I would also like to add the caveat that one of the things that's often talked about is while you're committing and while you're sort of trying to set a schedule, it's also important not to be too rigid with that. So, some days you'll sit down and you'll just feel like you can't do it, or you'll feel like, look, there's just too much going on right now. I just have too much in my life, or, too little in my life. And I really just feel like it's not for me today. And so if that's the case, or, maybe you normally practice sitting and for whatever reason, your legs just are feeling incredibly painful that day. If you're able to recognize, and what we'd say is mindfully decide not to do it. So you sit down and you go, okay, look, I'm feeling really tired. My legs are really sore. My mind is all over the place. I'm going to make the mindful choice at this moment in time to not do this today. I'll come back to it tomorrow. That's really important. And that's actually part of the practice as well, is recognizing when you should actually break that routine and you should not do it, because it would actually be more counterproductive to do it in that instance.
Yeah, because when you're really stressed out, when your legs are painful, it's easier to let your mind wander and let it ruminate on negative thoughts. Is that right?
Exactly. And the reality is, as I said, it's not an easy practice. So when you're first starting it out, you don't want to create more challenges for yourself than are necessary. So, there's a number of practices that really encourage you to meditate with your eyes open. And many people find that to be too difficult. Visual cues and distractions are difficult for many people to process while they're trying to focus on their breath. So, I myself, when I first started practicing, I really much preferred to have my eyes closed. It's a hell of a lot easier to focus on your breath when you're in a quiet room. Maybe you have noise canceling headphones, you have guided meditation, than it is to do it, in the middle of Times Square, where you've got all of these things going on around you. So when you're sort of first starting out, you don't want to create more obstacles for yourself than are necessary. And if you notice that you're just in a state on a particular day, you really just have too much in your mind, that's not the best time to sort of really get into it.
Yeah.
It's best, I guarantee you that stuff will come up anyway, even under the best of circumstances. So it's important to sort of note that there are some times and days when you just have to go, okay, well, look, not today. I'm going to do something else. Is that you need to burn off some energy, or I need to go for a run, or whatever it is that you do to sort of, or I need to call my mom or a friend or my partner to sort of just vent for a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's change gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the positives of mindfulness and how it can reduce stress. But are there any potentially adverse effects? Are there any reasons as to why I maybe shouldn't start the mindfulness practice?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I've already sort of hinted that, it very much depending on your goals. If your goal is relaxation, if your goal is better sleep, if your goal is various other things, there are potentially better ways to do it. If you're looking for something just to occupy your mind, there's lots of excellent games that you can play. Sudoku, there's many puzzles, there's word games, there's all kinds of things that you can do. You can sit and actually complete physical puzzles. I mean, there's many things you can do to occupy your mind. If you're looking to sleep better, there's other things that you can do. Probably getting more exercise, having a better diet, probably leaving your cell phone or your mobile phone outside of your bedroom. All of these things will potentially help you sleep better, right? So
Yep.
I think it's really important to know, well, why is it that you're wanting to do this? And there's probably other alternatives depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve that may be better suited to that purpose than mindfulness or meditation.
Yep.
Now, if you decide, regardless of all that, or you decide, irregardless of that, that mindfulness meditation is the thing for you, it's important to note that there are possible side effects or adverse effects. So for a number of people, when they're doing this practice, things like anxiety, things like stress actually get worse. Many people experience more intense pain in their body. And part of that is because of the nature of the practice. Often what you're doing is you're focusing on yourself. And for some individuals, that may make you that much more likely to have a panic attack, or it may make you that much, you're fixated on a pain in a particular part of your body. It may make it feel more intense initially. Now, that's not to say that, if you get good at it, that you might not be able to sort of work with that. But for some people, it can actually result in adverse events that are really difficult to manage.
Yep.
And, it's for those individuals, it's really a good idea to not engage in the practice or to not start with the practice, particularly in certain forms. Now, the things that we typically think of as being contraindications, if you have a serious mental illness, you don't want to dive into what we consider to be sort of the more traditional sort of, contemplation, looking at my thoughts or trying to focus on my breath, or lying down for 45 minutes and examining every part of my body. It's potentially not the best way to go.
Yeah.
If you have a history of trauma, you've experienced traumatic events and you haven't really managed it or dealt with it, it's very likely that trying to do an exploration of your thoughts, your experiences in your mind, are going to lead to you sort of re-experiencing or recalling that traumatic event. And there's a number of other things like that, where you should be aware of any of those kind of pre-existing risk factors that mindfulness or medication may not be the right thing for you. Now, there's a number of people who sort of decide that they want to do it anyway. And often my advice is, okay, if you have a family history of psychosis and you really want to do mindfulness, don't start with, exploring the depths of your psyche.
Yeah.
Start with, gentle gardening or with washing the dishes mindfully. If you have a history of trauma, don't start with a body scan, maybe start with gentle movement, practice yoga or Tai Chi and be mindful of what your body feels like when it's moving, or try walking meditation. It's also important to note though, even for people who aren't necessarily at risk, there can be some pretty intense side effects. Now, we don't know the rates of these things. We estimate that around, something like 1 to 5% of people will experience this. Mostly these things occur in intensive retreats, that is, 10-day silent retreats. But they do occur occasionally for people that are just practicing, in the context of something like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a program where you meet for about 2 hours a week for 8 weeks, and you practice for about 45 minutes a day on your own. And there can be really intense effects like dissociative episodes or delusional episodes or hallucinations. And it's really important to recognize when those things happen, that you can't just keep meditating through it. You really do need to seek out help from a clinician, GP, a psychiatric professional, or mental health professional, because more meditation is not necessarily going to get you through that. So any signs that those are the kind of things that are happening, you need to sort of stop and sort of consult someone. Now, the reality of practice, and if you really get deep into it, is that many of these practices sort of encourage you to question the nature of yourself and who you are. And so it may be sort of that, and we don't really know this is something we need more research onto, where kind of the normal effects of meditation practice and sort of coming to a deeper understanding of, well, what is the self, and what we consider to be something that is a dissociative episode, where the boundaries of those two things are is pretty unclear. And we're working to try and understand that better, but we're still not there. So for now, if you're thinking about it and it looks anything like that, the safest thing you can do is sort of reach out to someone and just talk through that, talk with them about sort of your experiences. There is actually a Facebook group founded by Willoughby Britton at Brown University called Cheetah House. And Cheetah House is actually designed for people who are experiencing adverse events in the context of meditation. So that's a great resource for people who are, something really terrible happens when they try to meditate. There is actually a group in Australia here as well doing that sort of is an offshoot of Cheetah House.
Oh, okay. So on the topic of research, I'd like to transition down to the more academic side of mindfulness. So you published a paper called Mind the Hype, Critical Evaluation and Prescriptive Agenda for Research on Mindfulness and Meditation. In it, you mentioned that mindfulness falls into the field of contemplative science. I was just wondering if you could give us a brief overview on what contemplative science is.
So contemplative science is sort of the term that has kind of fallen out of a number of meetings. So there's an organization called Mind and Life, or the Mind and Life Institute, which was formed in the late 90s out of a partnership between the Dalai Lama and a number of prominent scientists. One of the first was a neuroscientist named Francisco Varela. And the idea was that there are a number of parallels between the ideas and the principles and even sort of some of the traditions and theories in Buddhism and things in contemporary physics and neuroscience, and that there should be ways in which the practice of examining the mind, a la meditation, and what we're starting to learn about the mind from neuroscience or psychology can mutually inform one another. So the idea behind contemplative science is that there are a number of things in the context of Buddhist theory, and now sort of increasingly, within Christianity, Islam, Jainism, etc., there are ideas within there that are actually scientifically testable. That is, we can do empirical experiments to figure out whether or not those assertions are potentially empirically valid. Now, there are a number of assertions that we can just never test. Is there a God? Is there something like transcendence? There's no way of actually verifying, or falsifying those things, so we can't scientifically test it. But the field of contemplative science has as its core, or at its core rather, the idea or the interest in testing these assertions that go along with various types of contemplative practices. So there's lots of statements in historical texts that suggest doing such and such type of thing where you focus on your breath or mind in this way will result in these kinds of experiences. And so that's what the field of contemplative science has is sort of set itself as its goal to do, is sort of to test out the extent to which these things, these practices can be helpful or useful in contemporary society using the tools of psychology, neuroscience, and a number of other scientific disciplines and fields.
Ah, I see. So what are some of the hindrances that limit research in mindfulness?
So I think, one of the things that's incredibly difficult is that the nature of what we're studying is subjective, right? So we're talking about what it's like to be a person from that person's perspective. And so that's incredibly difficult to know. There isn't a truth for me that's necessarily the same truth for you, right? I mean, what I experience internally is not necessarily what you experience internally. And, we kind of have to take it at each other's word that I'm telling you the truth, because there's never a way for us to know. Now, within the context of contemplative science, there's this idea that sort of has come up that is integrating first, second, and third person methodologies. And so it's a really, really cool idea whereby they said, well, look, we can take a person reporting their experiences while someone else, maybe while they're meditating, we can have an extremely well-trained individual in the room with them. So maybe we take a Buddhist monk who has been meditating for 30 plus years and maybe has a PhD in neuroscience. They're rare, but they do exist. Okay. And then we put them in a brain scanner, right? So we can look at what's going on to their brain while they're telling us about what they're experiencing while they're meditating. And the monk / neuroscientist can help translate and say, they're talking about a particular state that we think of as such and such in this text. And this is a way of actually understanding it. So there's this really interesting work that's happening where we're merging what the person is saying with traditional understanding or psychological understandings of, what that might look like, with some kind of Buddhist or other map. And then we're looking at what's going on in the brain. Now, the reality is that's incredibly difficult to do, right? It's really hard to study that. It's really hard to put those different pieces together. So, a major hindrance to understanding these things is that a lot of the claims are quite bold. A lot of the ideas are quite big. And a lot of them are inherently subjective. They're about sort of how the person feels. And so it's quite difficult for us to operationalize those terms. Similarly, a lot of the claims sort of ultimately lead to things like enlightenment, that's the goal. And, those are terms that as a scientist, it's just incredibly difficult to operationalize. Another massive complexity in this field as a whole is that many of the people that study it scientifically also do it as a practitioner. And, many people say that's a really good thing, right? That you have to really understand what it is to, do the practice to sort of inform the research. And, there's arguments among clinicians that it's really important to know what it is to be a patient in order to be a good clinician. And so, they kind of mutually inform each other. But there are also some biases, right? And similar to sort of, being a good clinician, one issue that can arise is if you prescribe for your patients what works for you, not necessarily based on evidence, but based on your own experience. And there can be a similar problem in the context of studying meditation, which is that if you start to become biased to think that something works because it works for you, rather than based on what the empirical evidence says. And so because there's a lot of researchers who really personally, I want to say, buy into meditation, they're inherently oftentimes biased in the nature of their research. And in psychology, I mean, this is becoming a huge problem. There's been things like the reproducibility crises and things like that. Now, some of that is obviously people seeking to advance their careers and sort of potentially producing misleading results intentionally. A lot of it is unintentional. A lot of it is sort of people really strongly believing that these ideas are true. And as a result, potentially just nudging their results or nudging their data in particular ways. And so something like meditation is really difficult to do because, as I said, if you're someone who's really committed to meditation, it might be really hard for you to get results that suggest actually, it doesn't work as well as you think it does. And so there may be that extra temptation to, nudge your results in the direction of saying, maybe it looks more like it does work. So this is something we sort of talk about or think about as a conflict of interest. But I think it's a lot easier to acknowledge conflicts of interest in traditional areas of medicine, right? I mean, if you own stake in Pfizer and, you're testing a drug that comes from Pfizer, it's a very obvious conflict of interest. Whereas, if you're an avid meditator, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Are you open to your meditation practice not, fixing anxiety? Are you open to your meditation not working for everyone? Does it matter to you if it's sort of, you can't procure empirical evidence that it works in a randomized controlled trial? For some people, the answer to that is, yeah, that's fine. It doesn't have to work for everyone. It works for me in my own life. But for some people, it's not. For some people, they really want to believe that it works empirically, and that's the reason I do it.
Yep. So to summarize, we need to be really careful about the biases that may be introduced by certain researchers who participate in the practices they talk about.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it can be a huge benefit to be a practitioner and a researcher, but there are also drawbacks. And I think it's important that we recognize that and we balance those things.
Absolutely. So to conclude, is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have? Anything else that you want to talk about?
I think one thing to note is sort of one broad comment sort of that has to do with my paper in particular that myself and colleagues wrote is, what is the state of the field? What do we know in terms of how well mindfulness or meditation works for various things? So I think what we know is that it works reasonably okay for a lot of things. It's mostly helpful. It's mostly harmless, but there are certain circumstances in which it's not necessarily helpful. There are certain circumstances in which it is harmful. And there's just a lot that we don't know. So I think that the title of the paper was called Mind the Hype because there are a lot of promises being made about what this will do for you in your life. There are a lot of companies, there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of individuals who are trying to sell this, who want to make money, who are out there, or maybe they didn't even start that way. Maybe they just think that, you know, they're helping to do something really great in the world, and they're making really big promises. And I think it's important to temper expectations and to recognize that no single thing can fix everything, that mindfulness is not the solution for all of our problems, that it may work for some people some of the time, and it may work in amazing ways for some people, but it's not necessarily for everyone, and it's not going to fix every problem. So I think, you know, whenever you hear from someone promoting that this is the single fix, you know, kind of to sort of be a bit skeptical and to recognize that, okay, why are they trying to push this on me? What is it that they potentially have to gain? And if it's nothing, you know, if you can identify that sort of they don't have any obvious biases, okay, you know, maybe give it a shot and test for yourself. I think it's important to recognize that was something, you know, that the Buddha sort of said inherently is, don't believe anything just because I'm telling it to you to be true. Test it for yourself. The Dalai Lama often says the same thing. You know, go and try it out. See if it works. You know, see if it works for you. Don't believe me just because I'm the Dalai Lama. And I think, you know, similarly, we should sort of say the same thing of science. You know, just you know, to some extent, you can test some of these things for yourself. You know, read the papers, the academic papers, that is, and sort of evaluate the evidence for yourself to the extent that you can. And if you feel like you're unqualified, you know, go to the experts and sort of see what they have to say.
Yep. So we should treat mindfulness as a potential solution, when it's quite difficult to call it an absolute solution.
Absolutely. And I mean, my position would be there are no absolute solutions for most things, particularly in the case of mental health. I mean, I'm not sure in medicine more generally if there are absolute solutions.
Yep. All right. So that's all we have time for today. I hope everyone watching has learnt a little bit about mindfulness. Thanks again to Dr. Van Dam for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more, you can reach out. There's a website you can visit. And he's also starred in a documentary, Shannon Harvey's My Year of Living Mindfully, as well as he's also been on an episode of ABC's The Catalyst, The Mindfulness Experiment. With that being said, thanks so much for tuning in.